Greetings, StarBase 118. My name is Lieutenant Commander German Galven, and we have a very special interview with someone who has been a catalyst for the fleet for a very long time. Fleet Captain Aron Kells just took command of the USS Thor that launched recently from the Embassy of Tyrannus II. Thank you for agreeing to take a moment and be interviewed. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself for our listeners out there?
Hello, my name is Tony, which I use primarily in part because I've used half a dozen or more characters as primary characters since I first joined the Starbase 118 fleet back in 2005, 15 years ago now. Aron Kells is probably the character I've simmed for most often if you were to look at total time span I've spent with each of my characters, which is one of the reasons I chose him for command this time, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about later. A fun fact about me is that I joined Starbase 118 when I was still in high school, and I've just recently finished my PhD. So the group has seen me through my entire higher education journey, and 15 years really feels like 15 years when you're talking about the difference between high school and finishing grad school.
You just recently took command of the USS Thor. With your previous command service record, has it been a smooth transition process?
So the transition process has been pretty smooth. My first regular command in the fleet was of the Mercury. That was almost 8 years ago at this point, and that was definitely a more difficult situation. The original CO, the one who had actually launched that ship, retired only 4 months after the launch, and his replacement lasted about a week. So I was coming into certainly less than an ideal situation after that second new CO had to take an emergency long-term leave of absence. The Mercury's XO was really awesome through all of that. He was a great help to me. He really helped keep the group together. When I came on as the new CO for the Mercury, he was really instrumental in making sure that I had what I needed and in being a point of continuity for those folks who were continuing to write through that transition period. I knew when I found out what a force Brian had been, who's playing Lieutenant Commander Teller on the Thor and the Embassy, he'd really been holding things together in the same way as that XO I had on the Mercury. And that was really an important thing for me, to know that there was someone who was kind of taking charge and had been someone who folks look to as an authority figure during the transition period. I have found, both through my experience and from witnessing the experiences of others, that when you have multiple folks from a command staff taking LOAs or retiring or just leaving the command of a ship, then you tend to have a lot more folks who fall away from that ship as a transition to a new command staff is actually happening. So in this case, the staff has been really, really helpful and has served as an anchoring point for the Thor crew, I think.
With such a decorated service record, where and what kind of places do you turn to with that kind of dedication and contribution to 118?
So I like Star Trek a lot, shockingly, I know, because I'm doing this thing. That's definitely part of my persistence, both in Starbase 118 and just being a Star Trek fan. It's a really rich universe. There are always more stories to tell in that universe. But I am generally a fan of science fiction and fantasy, which I just abbreviate as SFF a lot of the time. I also co-host a podcast called The Imaginaries that is about to have its 4th anniversary. We look at contemporary science fiction and fantasy from a queer perspective as a part of The Imaginaries. So obviously I kind of have to plug that. If you want to check us out, you can go to imaginaries.net or look us up wherever you find your podcasts, whether that's iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube. Some of our back episodes are on YouTube, but basically wherever you look, you can look for the Imaginaries and find us. Which is to say, I have a lot of opinions when it comes to contemporary science fiction and fantasy. So rather than going through them all here, I will direct you to the Imaginaries, where you can listen to a lot of my opinions.
Out of the number of years you've been with the fleet, is there a specific time that stands out the most for you that's memorable?
So I have been in the fleet for a long time, about 15 years if you were to look at the initial date when I started. I've been here on and off. I have taken leaves of absence over the course of those 15 years, so it's not 15 years total. But I would say that the best time that I've had in the fleet was a time that came about because I had managed to attract and keep a group of dedicated, devoted simmers, many of whom are actually still around. This was a period years ago. I say that because I kind of don't remember, and also it's maybe an embarrassingly large number. But when it was starting to happen, I just happened to, I really think this was happenstance, end up with a group of folks who were dedicated, conscientious, empathetic, and who followed me when I was a CO on the Mercury, from the point when I was a CO on the Mercury through the Garuda onto the Invicta. And so having that group of folks around for months and in a lot of cases years was really kind of one of my best ongoing memories of the fleet. I know that's kind of a cop-out because it's not very specific, but I think, or I hope that you know what I mean when I say that having that kind of continuity was really a boon in an environment in which I feel like more recently in the last five, certainly in the last five, I would say maybe in the last 10 years, there's been kind of more of a sense of community and camaraderie in the fleets as a whole, and people stick around longer. But when I first started as a CO, that was not necessarily the way of it, and it had not been the way of it earlier on, or at least that was my assessment of what had been going on. So given that I was able to keep this core group, and in fact, again, many of them are still around, I felt very lucky. And so a lot of my best memories are a product of that group of people.
Before you wrote for Aron Kells, you had another character named Nicolo del Vedovo. What made you decide to use Kells rather than del Vedovo to command the USS Thor?
So like I said, I have had a number of recurring and primary and etc. characters in my time as the fleet. Most recently, not very most recently, but probably the character that people are going to recognize me for over the last couple of years was Nick Del Vedova on the Veritas. I have considered him as a primary character for a CO position before. I decided not to go with him this time simply because I wanted to return to a character who I knew very well as a commanding officer, and in part from an in-character story perspective, that Del Vedova is and has been a doctor and a diplomat, but only briefly a commanding officer, and the Thor is such a big, impressive ship that I was kind of buckling to the idea of, like, come on, they're not going to give this thing to a commander. Even if I upped him to captain, it felt like something that a very experienced officer would be getting and not a newbie. So you will probably see him possibly as my primary character in the future, but not probably for the Thor for a while.
What kind of advice would you give new and even current members of the fleet?
As for advice, I would always say, whether we're talking about writing for StarBase 118 or really doing anything, to surround yourself with people who are smarter and more talented than you are, not necessarily in the things that you want to be good at, but just who know things and can do things in a way that you can't do. Complementarity is definitely a thing that I have felt very lucky to have found and achieved in a way that has been very good for me as someone who has been with this community for a long time. Part of the reason that I remember the Mercury, Garuda, Invicti years so fondly is that I was surrounded by a really high caliber of raiders, just a really high caliber of people who complimented me in all these really effective ways. Again, a lot of them are still with the fleet. Some of them have become captains or otherwise promoted. So I just say, find yourself a particular community of people who challenge you, who lift you up at the same time you're lifting them up, and stick with them. And I think that's probably the best advice I could offer, both for this fleet and generally that's just like good life advice.
Thank you for your time, Fleet Captain Aron Kells. Back to you guys.